We're back for another week, and I'm happy to say I'm excited to be here. I'm glad you're here. This is the beginning of the show. Not everybody gets to hang out at the beginning of the show. It's a pretty sweet spot because it means you were paying attention. I don't know, to the calendar appointments that are a part of my newsletter for this, or maybe you clicked a little bell on YouTube and it told you, "Hey, Brett's going live." I was thinking of making the intro shorter, just to give people that are showing up when I show up, like to give them less wait time. We were gonna experiment this year with the intro, but not a lot of exciting stuff happening in terms of this. I'll work on this someday, but it's been around 4 or 5 years. The look is still, I think, fine. Sometimes you see the style of the internet change, and I was thinking maybe I should freshen it up, and then I got lazy, so I didn't do it. This is a Q&A, which means I have a few things I can talk about. I have a lot of things that I will happily talk about for an hour, but you're driving the topic today. I mean, you're choosing what we're going to talk about. Now, Nirmal's going to join me later. He's busy, stuck in some corporate boring meeting right now. A bunch of people talking on a Zoom or something. So he's going to show up later at some point. But for now, you get me. And what I was watching right before the show wasn't the latest actual DevOps tool, or is it? Because as you've probably seen me mention half a dozen times over the last year, a year ago this month, I changed my default browser for the first time. Well, for the first time in the last 20 years that I actually stuck with that default, because I've tried Safari and Firefox as my default for many years. And they've always been my alternate browsers. But Chrome, I mean, when Chrome showed up 20 years ago, it had tabs. It blew our minds that it had multiple websites in one window. We had a lot of browsers before that, but there was only one other browser I remember that was actually before them that did that, and it was on a Linux desktop, which means there was only like 1% of us that could get to use it because, not that many people were using Linux desktops in 2002 or 2003 or whenever that was. Anyway, fast forward to this year, or to last year, and Matt Williams, who we're going to have on the show pretty soon to talk about Ollama AI, because if you haven't seen his channel, his YouTube channel's got a bunch of Ollama content, and I need to catch up. There's a lot of running offline local LLMs that I don't know. There's a lot going on there, and he's the guy. And so we're going to have him on the show. We're actually booking, I think, for either this month or next month. I'm not really sure what week we have. But, oh man, we've got a packed schedule for the spring, coming all the way up to Kubernetes, all the way up to KubeCon. And then I'm going to be in KubeCon Paris. If you're going to be there, hit me up somewhere on the internet, somewhere in the comments or in the DMs of something, and let me know, because we always get together and we all have a drink, we all take a selfie, we hang out in the expo hall together. So yeah, we should do that if you're going to go to KubeCon in Paris. I'm excited because it's been a while since I've been to a European conference. I think actually pre-COVID. That's a long time ago, it feels like. So yeah, lots of shows coming, a lot of AI stuff. But ironically, the thing that I'm really using the most right now in AI are two different tools that you're probably already using, or you probably already know about, or if you've watched me, you've probably listened to me. The first is the Arc browser. And now I get a question on about every week's video. Like if there's going to be a comment lately on a video, it's, "Hey, what was that thing that slid out on your browser on the side? Like, what's that thing?" Well, that's Arc browser. And today they announced their next sort of focus on the browser for 2024. I think, as a engineering professional, I don't know how I got along without this tool. It does so much that Chrome doesn't do, and it saves me so much time where, I can't imagine going back to Chrome at this point. There's just too much going on here that, just for example, you think you got a lot of tabs, and you got pinned tabs, and you've got grouped tabs in Chrome and all that. Well, what I got is all these tabs across all sorts of projects and folders. And yeah, so each project can be a different thing, different color. So I group my project. I work differently now because of this stinking browser. And so they today, right before this, they announced their next new feature, which look, we all use a browser all day long to do DevOps and to do engineering. So I feel like it's a tool that we're always searching to be more optimum for engineering. And what does that mean? There's not really an engineering browser unless you're a front end developer, and then of course you have your special browsers that have all the wonderful tools built in. But one of the things I love about this browser is the pop-up, and now the pop-up is getting more AI features. And so I did this earlier, right before the show. I get this question a lot. What is the best Kubernetes ingress controller? And so I could say, what is the best Kubernetes ingress controller? Now, I could just go ask ChatGPT. That's this option. And, if I'm on free version, I get GPT 3.5. If I pay for it, I get 4.0 or all those other things. So I'm going to do this one. It's called an instant open, which skips the search engine. And I think it just picks the do you feel lucky? I'm not actually sure what it's doing in the background. But according to the Arc browser company, this fresh new release that just got released like 2 hours ago. So it just picked, of course, Reddit. Yeah, I mean, it's Reddit. Of course it's going to be in the top choices. But it gives me a list and from Reddit. So great. But what if I kind of wanted some more options? Well, there's this concept of folders for all your tabs. And so I can now say, give me a folder. I said this before. Give me a folder of good ingress options for Kubernetes. So it's going to use Google search to go out, find what it thinks are the best links about that query. And essentially in the background, it's using GPT. I think that I don't think they're running their own custom LLM, but I'm not actually sure about that. They haven't discussed what their engineering backend is. But then I look through these, and it's got the official documentation. It's got the nice Reddit list. It's got a couple of good blogs. Loft, in fact, I know Loft is a nice blog because it's not riddled with ads and spam and all that stuff because they're a nice company. And then a couple of, so-so links that I maybe don't want to watch. Anyway, this is just a few of the new features in this browser. And one thing you'll notice is it skips Google search. Like, I don't need Google search as much. I mean, there's probably times where I'm still going to wish I had it. But that's the first time, and that's what they're calling this, by the way. Their little marketing is the browser that browses for you. So I feel like it's an essential DevOps tool. Your browser is where you keep all of your DevOps tools in it. You need it to all these web consoles for your cloud and all the other Kubernetes GUI and you name it. It's all in there. Portainer, if you're doing a Portainer GUI for Swarm or Docker or Kubernetes, these are all in your browser. So the browser is super important today, even as a DevOps professional. Hell, if I'm using code spaces, I'm probably going to, if I'm going to use code spaces on a GitHub PR, on someone else's PR, someone else's code, so maybe I don't need to copy it locally, I'm going to use code spaces, and that's going to be in my browser. So let's go over here to code spaces, and is it not code spaces? Code space? Maybe it's code space. That's what it is. Codespace.github.io, maybe. What is happening to GitHub? How do I get to my code spaces now? They've changed the URL. I don't even know how to get to my own code spaces. Go to the code spaces. What is that URL? Oh, it's now github.com/codespaces. Got it. I am up to date. Got it. Anyway, if I'm going to use Codespaces, I'm probably just going to use this in my browser with the Codespace server. So I'm not even going to leave my browser to work in VS Code in a browser. It's pretty good. I mean, if you're a keyboard shortcut person, there can be some problems. But Arc can actually handle that too. You can kind of go into all the keyboard settings, and you can say, which I'm guessing you can do this in Chrome, but I'm not even sure if you can. If I go into settings and into my shortcuts, can we see that? Yeah. Into my shortcuts, I can say that maybe if I'm doing VS Code in the browser a lot, a particular, I'm trying to think of a particular shortcut, Command K. So there is nothing for Command K, so that's cool. I can actually type that. It'll go right through the browser. But if I needed to use a shortcut that was Shift Command K on a Mac, because Macs have the command, I can say prefer websites, which means if my website has this shortcut, put it into the website first. Or if I prefer that it's a Arc browser shortcut, because Arc browser has tons of keyboard shortcuts, just like Chrome. Chrome has that. Firefox has that. And if I prefer this to go directly to my browser, then I can use that. If I say both, what's interesting here is that it will, because I'm a keyboardist, what I like here is that I can hit it once and I'll get a little pop-up that says, hey, I just sent it to the app in the browser. If you want to use it in Arc, do it again right now. And so I just repeat it twice and it'll shoot it to my Arc browser app rather than the website itself. But I'll leave that as the default. Anyway, this just happened, so it's on top of my mind. But I'm here for your questions. So let's see what we got. Hello. What's up, all the regulars? Kumajiru is back. DJ is back. DJ, did I notice your screen last time that Arc hides the full URLs of the pages you visit? Just shows the domain name. Is that configurable? Drives me mad, and in my opinion, is anti-web. Yes. The presumption here is that with Arc, by default, I mean, all the other browsers are doing this too, so it's really just the trend, is that unless you're a nerd like us, welcome to the Nerd Club. I prefer the term geek, but everybody has their favorite. We don't necessarily need the full URL every time. What we're trying to do is get the rest of the interface out of the way, but there's very easy ways to see it. If you just hit L, or on Mac, it's Command L. On Windows, it's probably Control L. You get to see the full URL and you can change it. Or if you always want to see the full URL up here, you can just put it into what's called developer mode. And you get this nice little bar at the top that gives you the full URL. And you can do things like capture the entire web page in a single screenshot. You can get all of the developer tools that you would normally get with right-click inspect, and then all of your extensions. So you get a lot more information in this tiny little bar, but it's not there by default. And you can enable it and disable it, and it remembers per website. So for all of my favorite websites, I'm actually surprised I don't have this on GitHub, but on my Notion, for example, over here, I have it enabled just for my Notion pages, so it remembers it for that domain. Yeah, stuff like that. You know, all that stuff. But if you go to a regular website, it turns it off because I didn't enable it for that domain. So it's kind of a domain feature. Plus, you know, like you said, I have basically all of my previous searches and previous things in this Command T, but it also works with Command L. Command L shows me the URL of the website or page or tab, I guess, that I'm on. And Command T opens up a new tab and allows me to go somewhere else, like YouTube, right? Or Hacker News, right? So that's a new tab. Anyway, everything's keyboard shortcut on there, and that's what I use. So, oh, and by the way, we're talking about this, right? So I just think it's useful for DevOps because I personally have been using it for all of my projects for the last year. So I store folders of web pages, and increasingly more and more the apps I use are a web page. So I keep them grouped. And unlike Chrome, all of these tabs, all of these folders sync across all of my machines. My Macs right now, they don't have Windows Sync that's coming soon, so you can't really sync across OSs. But across platforms, these do sync across my Macs and across my iPhones because there's a browser, Arc browser for iPhone, and it keeps track of all those. So I've actually gotten rid of a couple of tools for reading, and I use this on my mobile device. If I'm ever looking at a tab and I'm like, I want to read that later, I want to put that on my reading list, I can just send it to the Arc browser on that, and it will sync it into my bookmark list. And then I have folders that I put stuff in automatically for reading later. And I essentially have my own. I mean, it's kind of like Pocket at that point, except it doesn't offline the web pages. So I guess Pocket is still better if you're someone who likes to read and save links for later. Good question. I completed your Docker course in Udemy. Is your Kubernetes course going to help me get more info? So yes, the Kubernetes course does two things. One, the Kubernetes course goes a little bit deeper into the insides and internals a little bit. And then the Kubernetes Mastery course assumes you know Docker. So it doesn't start with Docker or Compose or how containers work or what registries are. It assumes you know all that and just starts with Kubernetes 101. And it goes a little bit deeper into a few of the internals, as well as it's a completely different set of exercises. So it just gives you different and more experience. Does that answer the question? If they're both, I feel like they're both compatible. There's a lot of redundancy because obviously I'm teaching the same core concepts, but the stuff in Kubernetes Mastery is just completely different examples. So it's better. It's more practice. And there's a sale going on right now. So if everyone, if you didn't know, my courses are on sale this week for the Black Friday price style thing. If you go over to Bret.news, you can get on the newsletter. And this week was called, this week's newsletter was just Gratitude Week. And in there are links down near the bottom, the links for all of the sales. So you can either join the newsletter to get those sales on all 4 courses, or use the coupon code Docker24 for my courses, which will end tomorrow, February 2nd, at the end of the day. So buy them either today or tomorrow. They're $10 US American dollars. I don't know what they will be in other countries because Udemy changes the prices based on your market. So they're probably cheaper in places overseas that have a different income, right? So use Udemy code, so yeah, the courses are meant to build on each other. Docker Mastery is meant to be my main entry course for all things containers. If you're new to containers, I put the most effort into that. So that's the longest course. It's 21 hours at this point. More hours are coming. It gets you far enough in each part that's important, like Docker and Kubernetes and Swarm and CI/CD. Like it touches on a lot of these different topics enough to give you this well-rounded beginning. And then if you want to go deeper into Kubernetes, there's Kubernetes Mastery. If you want to go deeper into Swarm Mastery, that's a different course. If you want to go deeper into Node.js and how Docker works best with Node.js development, that's the third course. That's the third and fourth course. So they all are sort of jumping off points from Docker Mastery is how I look at it. All right, let's see what other questions we got. This is a good question. Arvinid, sorry if I mispronounced that. How to develop DevOps design for an application? Is there any certain points to consider when creating deployment architecture of an application? I guess there's some general guidelines. Let's not talk about tools, right? Because I don't know what tools you're using. I don't know what cloud you're on. The jets are awfully loud today. I live near a U.S. military Navy base with jets, so every once in a while they like to perform stunts over the city. So, yay! All right, I would say in general, there's a couple of things that I look at. This is a great question because it kind of goes to first principles of DevOps. And so the first thing I do is if someone needs a refresher on the origins of DevOps, it was a large portion of it was around culture and people and processes. So we won't go into all of that. But the other part of that was around how to build your systems so that they are agile. Now, I'm not talking specifically about agile development. I'm just saying that your systems are flexible enough so that a team can collaborate together and easily deploy that application anywhere. That's whether that's on your local machine, whether that's on a cloud or on-prem, or something in your closet. All of this should be easily repeatable and and that it's not completely different to run it locally than it is in the cloud versus on-prem. The idea is that you're trying to consolidate. So that all being said, the 12-factor app website is absolutely something. It's still 15 years later. This is pre-Docker ideas. They still hold up. There's a couple of technology references that we've maybe supplanted, like talking about environment variables, and maybe if you're writing modern applications, you might use config maps to actually store secrets and things in files rather than environment variables. That's fine. So when you see the word environment variables, you think, well, they're really just talking about a simple storage system that all my apps can gather their environment settings. So you don't get too focused on that. They have a whole rule around automating and being able to ensure that the steps are consistent across your CI and deployment models. There's a whole bunch in there, and it's really, really fast to read. You can read this. If you're a slow reader, it just takes you an afternoon. If you're a fast reader, it's like an hour. I mean, some of these pages aren't even a full page of content. They're just talking about, this is concepts of like application design, right? But some of the best ones are about config and how you store your config. So the reason I'm bringing this up is, sure, we can talk about CI and CD and automating deployments, but if you don't have the 12-factor mindset, a lot of the other things that you're going to need to do in automation and in deployment you're going to struggle with, because you're not coming from this place of understanding the core problems and the core solution mindset that you need to have. So to me, the 12-factor app is a required reading, just like I say DevOps Handbook is required reading. These are fundamentals, not necessarily going to help you implement CI. They're just the fundamentals of understanding why we exist as DevOps roles, right? So, okay, that being said, let's get back to your question, because it's a great one. Any certain points to consider when creating application architecture? So I have to imagine that my application can run on my local machine in CI and in the cloud, and I don't want more than any one thing running in a single container, right? So I don't want my worker jobs and my API all running in the same container. So when you think about abstracting out the parts of your application, I don't care whether you go monolith or you go microservice or the middle ground there, which is what I like, which is it's not quite a microservice, not quite a monolith, right? I do break out the parts. The front end's the front end container. The back end's the back end container. We sometimes call that an API. There's maybe some worker jobs or cron job types things, worker processes. There's separate containers. Now, these things may all exist in the same GitHub repo or in separate repos. I don't really care. It doesn't really matter. That's really a culture thing that you can do great works with either design of monolithic repos or many small repos. I tend to dance in the middle, right? I don't make more repos until it makes sense to make more repos, but I often have app repos and then a Kubernetes YAML repo, and then maybe something like an Argo CD or my deployment tool, Flux, whatever I might be using for deploying my apps. That's a separate repo than my Kubernetes YAML. I want my application developers and the DevOps people to all work together on that Kubernetes repo. And then I want my application developers to really not have to worry about anything that doesn't describe their app. I don't want them to have to worry about my Argo CD deployment designs. They can. I mean, they're going to have access to see it, but I don't want them to be forced to learn their app, how to develop it, learn GitHub Actions or whatever the CI tool is, then learn Kubernetes YAML, which I will help them with. I don't think that they need to memorize all that unless they want to be a Kubernetes admin. And then they're probably going to need to deploy it. And I don't need them to learn Argo CD, YAML, and how all of those different files need to be worked together. I want to help them with that as the operations/DevOps role. Okay? And so if I go to github.com, I have an example organization. This is what I use inside of my Argo CD course, which, if you want to learn more about Kubernetes deployments, GitHub Actions, Argo CD, GitOps, that's all in this course, by the way. You can go jump onto that, and I will give you that link. So I'm going to give you this link right here first. This is the important link. This is a GitHub sample organization where I break out my application itself, the workflows that I'm going to use in CI, as well as where I'm doing my Docker builds and where I store my Kubernetes YAML and my Argo CD YAML. And so if you think of those tools as, my CI workflows, my Kubernetes application design, kind of like a compose file, right? Whether that's Helm or Customize or just Manifest, doesn't really matter. And then finally, my deployment YAML specification. And that's where I have all these repos. I, for example, have one just for the Argo CD YAML. And then I have another one for my Kubernetes YAML, and that's per app. So this Wordsmith app is what I'm deploying, and I have a Wordsmith front-end repo, a Wordsmith back-end repo. There's a database component and a Redis-style key-value kind of thing maybe. And then I have a Kubernetes repo that has all of the default YAML for that application. So this is the thing where maybe if you're the DevOps expert, you are taking, maybe a developer's created Docker files. Maybe they've also created Compose. And they are going to give you that. And maybe if they don't know Kubernetes, maybe they're going to give you that and you help create the Kubernetes YAML. So they don't have to be the expert in the Kubernetes YAML. In this case, I'm using Customize, which is a very simple templating engine for Kubernetes. And there we go. And we got a guest in the green room. My co-host is here. Let me figure out how to bring him on. There we are.
Sorry for being late, Brett.
Thanks for being here.
Apologies.
Yeah, I'm glad you're back. I was talking about a great question. Is there any certain points to consider when creating a deployment architecture of an application? And I was sort of showing off on this sample organization that I have, kind of the repo design that you might consider. That's part of your application deployment, is where are all these files going to go? That's a very common question. Do I put things in my application repos? Do I have a separate repo for everything? And I kind of do the middle. Like I try to make the DevOps YAML in a separate place. If it's not used for local development, I try to put it in a separate place. And then as the team's needs grow, I split it up only as needed. Like when we start having challenges with permissions and if there's too many updates to a single repo and people are having a hard time, maybe we split it out. What is your opinions? How do you have like your own preferences? Of course, it depends on the size of the team. I think that's the biggest.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, like, this is like it'll sound like a non-answer, but it's closer to truth, which is you need to mirror your organizational structure, or what you choose will dictate your organizational structure. So it's like you want to pick which direction you want to go with this, right? So if you're working somewhere where there exists an organizational structure, you're going to have to think about whether you want to match the microservices, the repos, the content to that organizational structure and the culture within those teams, right? Do those teams have a SRE mentality? Are they responsible for, are they on call, right? Like, are you replacing me with ChatGPT while I'm responding to your question?
Oops. No, because ChatGPT did not answer my question and got it wrong. While you were talking, I was going to ask you,
do I still have a job?
Yes, you still have a job. I was actually watching a video last night about.
I didn't know this. Go ahead.
We're all like a tangent of a tangent here, but the tangent I was going down was I watched a video last night about the state of mathematics and the LLMs. And it was someone, I can't think of her name. She has like over 1 million subscribers on YouTube. And she's a mathematics, I guess she's a professor, maybe she's a pro. And she's showing that there's this worldwide mathematical, I think it's a geometry problem. And like the state of LLM. It's like the IBM challenge in chess, right? Back in the day,
Yeah,
and you're just
yeah.
and she's showing the graph of like over time how LLMs have now exceeded all but the world champion in speed of solving problems in geometry. I think it's specifically geometry. Anyway, so she's like, well, we're not replaced yet as humans, but it's even now faster than the people that compete for the world championship. They're just not. It's just not as fast as the world champion. But we're like probably weeks away from that happening. So yeah, even geometry. She was like, I think the title of her video was, Do I need to be worried about my job?
The answer is no and yes at the same time.
It's yes. No, what I was going to ask you was, do you remember what that's called? The software, the representation of how your software is designed is naturally always going to look like your organizational structure, and there's like a law, or it's like Moore's law or something like that. Where
is it Shannon's law? No, it's it's there is a as I'm frantically googling.
Yeah,
Conway's law. Conway's law.
Conway's law.
There we go. I'll put this in the chat. This kind of dictates a lot of
principle that states that organizations design systems that mirror their own communication structure.
Martial law. At first, I thought that said marital law, and I was like, "Well, that does dictate structure too."
They're kind of the
same. But yeah, back to what I was trying to say, Brett. You either match your repo structure and CI/CD processes and automation to your existing organizational structure, or you adapt your organizational structure to the end state architecture that you're trying to achieve. And for those who've followed the kinds of talks I've done for a long time, and followed the DevOps topic that I've talked about a lot, it's about that. It's about the cultural aspect and the meat space aspects of the things that we talk about, right? Like we love to talk about the technologies, and they definitely have a big impact. But I would argue, my argument is that you can have the most amazing CI/CD tooling and like Git architecture and YAML generating application on the planet, but if you don't resolve any of your organizational or structural or how people interact and work together, it's only going to take you so far, and likely is not going to be successful as much as we want the technology just to fix all those things.
It's like if you wanted to make it different, it's almost like it's the default nature of the style and size and culture of your organization to be reflected in your software, and it's not impossible to prevent it, but it's the default nature. So, like for example, a single individual, or what I would call solo DevOps, a solo DevOps likely means that they're doing a ton in one repo, and they're probably not considering they're probably doing things that only work on their machine. Like they maybe are using Terraform by default with the Terraform file on their local machine and not putting it in central storage. And like there's habits that they will accidentally stumble into even when they want to resist it. That's why in my consulting, the way that it motivates me to not do that, because I'm the solo DevOps person a lot of times, the way I approach it is that I want to be replaced. I think about every day when I'm working, if I do this and only I know how to do it, and I'm the only one with the permissions or the access or whatever, then I'm not replaceable, and I don't want this job forever. So I want to be able to go do other fun things. And so I don't know if you can all have that mindset, but if you have the idea of I need my exit to be easy, and it's not so much I need to be replaced, but it's like I need to be able to move on to the next greener pasture at any time and not feel like I'm leaving a mess of things that no one else will know how to do, and it's not documented, and it's not
Yeah.
reflected in the design. If you keep that mindset, I find it's a healthier design. That solves the problem of
Yeah.
small teams. It doesn't solve the problem of big, complicated. Like how do these big? I'm always amazed on like how Apple ships updates so reliably and so consistently.
Yeah.
Yet,
I
despite they have hundreds of thousands of people and tens of thousands of engineers, like it seems simple to us, but that's a real skill. That they're
uh,
doing that.
Absolutely. I mean, before I joined AWS, I've worked on and helped implement some organizational structure and DevOps practices, both on the cultural and tooling side, for organizations of various sizes. But now I'm on like this side of the fence at AWS and watching how we deploy services and
Hmm.
like do region build outs and things like that. It's absolutely, it's very mind blowing. It's
Yeah.
both like yeah, I mean there's some really good. We're pretty transparent about how we do. Or when I say we, I mean AWS. AWS is very transparent about how they implement what before, like DevOps practices before DevOps existed, right? So a lot of this stuff was created because it needed to exist to just
Yeah.
be able to do the scale that AWS runs at, and um, they they've done a lot of tooling and created a lot of things to that didn't exist, right? They just had to create it because they couldn't buy something off the shelf, and a lot of those lessons learned are embedded in DevOps practices today, in the tooling and um, how we think about managing deployments, and even things like team sizes and developers being their own SREs, responsible for their production environment, things like that. Like all that comes from not only like Apple and other companies, but AWS as well, and lessons from deploying at scale. There was some there's some great videos from reInvent over the years describing how all that stuff works.
Oh, so
It's really mind
like
blowing.
inside baseball, or like yeah, how the
Yeah.
what is it? How the cookies are made, or I don't know what's that analogy? How the sauce is made?
Yeah, we'll say with sauce. We'll go with sauce.
Sauce.
um, wow,
Every time I hear the
going
word
right
sauce,
to joining and going right for got really philosophical right
you
right off
did.
the bat.
I mean, I threw you in the deep end. That's what happens when you come in halfway through.
Ooh, fair, fair.
Oh, by the
Um,
way, I didn't tell you before the show, but we need to figure out how to market or mark. Sorry, not market. Mark the. We're gonna need to think about while we're answering these questions, the good ones, so that we can make clips of them later. We're gonna start doing that. It's for you people on the internet. We
yes.
too need clips because we all have. I mean, who's got an hour to watch this show? Well, those of you
Yeah.
that are watching, you have at least
Brett,
some time, but
yes.
we need to
Brett
make
needs
clips.
clips.
Um, Dan's asking a great question, and I'm glad you're here because I didn't want to have to stumble through it. I don't understand Amazon ALBs and ingress. Can you explain Amazon ingress? It goes on to talk about what is Amazon NLB ALB, and then I know how to use them, but how do I use them for ingress? Um, I want to use traffic. Got V3 working. This is a lot of different thoughts, Dan. We're talking about traffic and
Dan's trying to get
ingress
traffic
on
to a pod.
Kubernetes and yeah.
Dan is trying to get traffic to a pod. Um, how do you do it? So great questions. Let me take the middle one first. What is Amazon NLB and ALB? Great question. So NLB stands for Network Load Balancer. ALB stands for Application Load Balancer. And as the names allude to, the Network Load Balancer is a service that works. It's a load balancer that works at the ISO level 4 of the network stack. So level 4 meaning TCP, UDP, that kind of protocol level. And so network load balancer um, is not aware of your HTTP endpoint and like a URL or any of that kind of stuff. It's at the network layer level. So you would use an NLB for maybe you've got some kind of like you're streaming data, or you've got some proprietary protocol that you're exposing over an end that you want to get that you want to expose, and it's not like HTTP. Maybe it's like a UDP protocol. You'd use NLBs for that. Application load balancer is a different type of load balancer that service, and that's at the application level. So think HTTP, layer 7 of the network stack, and it is aware of things that you would expect from an ingress. So let me take a step back. In Kubernetes, you have different types of networking services for your different types of services. You can do like cluster IP, node IP, and if you want to know more about that, take Bret's course. Right, Bret, you cover these differences with respect to the services, and then you also have the load balancer type, and the load balancer type can be used for the layer 4 load balancing, but it can also in conjunction with an ingress controller, be used for the ingress type resource within Kubernetes. And these are two separate kind of resources within Kubernetes. Load balancing is just what it says on the label. You're load balancing traffic that's coming into the cluster to the different pods that support that service. Ingress is at that layer 7. So you're specifying the routing for how that load balancer directs traffic based on the path of your service. So like if you have Bret Fisher, let's say bretfisher.com/application A, you could use an ingress resource to point that to the application A pods and endpoints. And maybe you have bret.com/application B. I don't know. I can't come up with a more creative name. Maybe cats and dogs. And the dogs one goes to a different set of pods, a different service, or maybe a different microservice. And so that's ingress. And to close the loop on this, how do you use it? AWS has an open source AWS load balancer controller. And that is a open source Kubernetes operator that when it detects a load balancer service resource or an ingress resource, it will spin up a ALB or NLB based on your configuration automatically and connects that ALB within your VPC to the Kubernetes services and endpoints. Yep, I was just about to send out more details and links, but we have a best practices guide. We have documentation on the AWS load balancer that Bret just pulled up. And then there's also a best practices guide on how to best configure it so that you are aware of the caveats and the considerations for using it. You are not alone with asking questions about ingress and network load balancers. Probably a really good discussion topic for a show, Bret. Maybe getting some people from Traffic or maybe from AWS to talk about this, because this is where the rubber meets the road with respect to your application deployments, right? Like eventually you're going to have to expose your application to the outside world, if or to other, maybe not the outside world, but to other services, other places, and you're going to probably use a load balancer at some point to do that.
Yeah, I guess it's worth mentioning too. That's a fantastic review. Thank you. That was a very good 3-minute description of it. If there's a piece missing, and I don't know, Dan, how much experience. It sounds like you have some experience. You understand traffic. You understand what the different ingresses are. One of the first decisions when you're deploying Kubernetes in the cloud is, do I want to run my own ingress, or do I want to outsource that to the cloud? I always prefer to outsource it to the cloud. Granted, sometimes because you get all these extra benefits and performance enhancements by doing that, sometimes people, especially depending on the style and size of your environment, people might opt to redesign later to optimize for pricing. And so sometimes there's optimizing for features, sometimes optimizing for pricing. You have different requirements, right? So every project does. But the key here is that Kubernetes doesn't have ingress built in. It has a resource called ingress, but it doesn't know what to do with it. So you do have to pick, like you've probably figured out, a provider, and you can either run your own like Traffic, right? So Traffic would mean you're running it in your cluster, and Traffic itself understands the Kubernetes API. And so it can talk directly. You don't really need a separate Traffic controller design or anything like that. It's just Traffic. That's one of the features of Traffic, is that it understands Docker APIs and Kubernetes APIs directly. It's kind of that's kind of how it made its name for itself. Now with Amazon, those load balancer things have existed pre-Kubernetes. So
Correct.
They don't talk directly
service
to your API, right?
Yeah, they're outside of the cluster. They're managed
and they're
service
outside, right? Yeah, they're not. Yeah. You're not installing these. The proxies aren't actually running in your cluster, but you do need this controller. This is the piece that links these outside resources like ALBs and NLBs, which is really ALB versus NLB. Like it was a great thing that we're going to turn that into a clip faux show of Nirmal describing that, but that's really an application decision or an architecture decision of your cluster, which one you use. Do you even want those at all? Do you want to run your own, which is more work on you, but might be preferred? I don't know. There's various reasons why you might do that, but I try to run as few, I almost said as many, as few ingress controller designs and all that as possible. Like if I'm going to use ALBs, I try to use just that and not another proxy system inside my cluster so that I end up with two, or, I've got to run something locally and something elsewhere outside of AWS. So there are a lot of considerations there. I don't get hung up on the fact that the one I'm using locally might be different than the one I use in AWS. I'm curious, by the way, I haven't actually had to do this yet. With what's the AWS tool, the open source project that allows you to simulate some of the AWS stuff locally? Local.
It's not an AWS tool, but it's Local Stack.
Local Stack. Yeah, it's not. It's just open source. It's not AWS's. Yeah. But
yeah,
I don't know if Local Stack offers ALB, NLB simulations for Kubernetes. Like, what if someone's running AWS ALBs and NLBs in production? How do I use those ingresses locally? I guess I would have to use the ingress resource and not use the custom Kubernetes resource for ALBs. I don't actually know how to solve that problem.
So what I've seen customers do is, if they're doing it locally, they'll likely use like something like an Nginx, like the local Nginx load balancer controller, kind of the default option, because you can still like identify your ingress path rules and things like that, and then you can translate that into the load balancer controller. There is some ELB, elastic load balancing. There's some simulation of that in Local Stack. I'm just pulling up the docs for it.
Yeah,
I've not used Local Stack in a little while, but that's a separate company and a separate piece of software. But yeah, there's lots of options out there for load balancing and network. Then there's also Istio, which is like the service mesh. This is where like service mesh, one of service mesh's main use case was this exact thing as well, right? Like, so you could go that route. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it right away.
Well, it is advanced, so like, you definitely got to be. This actually, it's funny. You and I could talk about this for the whole hour. Like, we really could.
It's
we're
a
both
big topic. Like, networking is a huge topic.
I was about to go down a rabbit hole because we need to do a show on Gateway API hitting 1.0 because we've
Oh
had
yeah.
shows on Gateway API like years ago. Um, but we're now finally at 1.0. It's something that I wanted to write about and sort of run through some demos of moving from Ingress to Gateway. And
Yeah.
there's all these questions around when you use Ingress versus Gateway. And so,
And that was a big announcement at KubeCon
yeah,
back in November, right? Like
it was,
a lot of
it was
people have
big.
been waiting for this. Yeah.
So I was curious if AWS ALBs support that resource, and
So
we
there,
need a show.
yeah, there's work there's a lot to that, and I can talk to. Not only can I talk to it, but I think it would probably be good to have a guest on to kind of
Mm,
dig into this topic, or
yeah,
multiple guests on this topic. The TLDR is we have another service called VPC Lattice that has a gateway API controller. There's gateway API support in EKS. So yeah, there's different ways to kind of accomplish that depending on the use case.
yeah,
Good questions. That was a
yeah.
great Dan. That was a great question.
That's a good question. Next question, because we're going to skip ahead. We'll come back to it if we need to. Oh, um, very new to YAML. What is the best and simple way to learn and write Kubernetes YAML files? The best and simple. Well, those are not always the same.
Those words are
Possible at the same
not
time.
usually those words are usually not combined with the word YAML often. um, use an IDE that's YAML aware
Yep.
because YAML is sensitive. It's what's that called? What is it when a like programming language is
Syntax aware.
no, it's like the
IntelliSense.
spacing and the
Oh,
tabs and all that. It's like Python, like you have to the formatting matters with respect
yes.
to YAML. um, yeah, so that's right, DJ. Disable your tab key and off you go. So um, the best thing to have is a YAML linter in an IDE of your choice, so that you're formatting your YAML properly. Honestly, the Kubernetes documentation has great examples of YAML that's to spec, and likely a great way to kind of just like see what the YAML looks like for that resource. The other thing is you can use kubectl to spit out, like if you want to see the YAML for a specific resource on your existing cluster, you use that as a starting point. And then also go to Bret Fisher's repos and find examples. Probably should have
Yeah.
started with that.
Yeah, that's a good example of what you're talking about. Basically, just get an existing resource -o YAML, and you will output the real YAML, and you'll learn that there's a little. I can't actually run this because Kubernetes isn't running on my machine right now, but you could run this, and then you'll get the YAML from that. That's one way to do it. This is a great plug for my Kubernetes mastery course because I make a focused effort in at least one of the videos in Kubernetes mastery. Available over on that website over there at bretfisher.com. I just put the sales coupon in. We're having a big fire sale this week, $9.99 American dollars for every one of my courses. There's a video in there that talks about this technique, and because I'm not a fan of randomly Googling and going to old Medium articles or old blog articles where someone is giving me a snippet and then using that, because these syntaxes change, and maybe not this year. Well, Gateway API has changed, but it really sucks when like the API version is different, and maybe even the resource is different now because it's a different. It's moved out of alpha or beta, and so that can be very frustrating. So if you just look at the kubectl, just hit the command, and you can see some advanced stuff here. And I'm looking to see where they list it. Explain is a really great command for, I can walk through the API and understand what options are for a resource, because that's one of the real challenges is I see an example and it has like 3 things in it, but what other things can I do in that ingress rule or in that that deployment spec or whatever, and you can get all that with the CLI. But ChatGPT is your friend. VS Code has all these wonderful add-ins to make it so easy to edit. And another plug for something that's totally free from me. Nirmal and I have talked about this before, but if you're going to be writing a lot of pod specs, most of the things you're creating, at least most of the things in a normal Kubernetes cluster that you're creating, are going to have a pod spec. There's others resources that you'll have to care about. You have to care about services, ingresses, RBAC, like all these things, but they're all to serve the pod. They're all about the pod. And so the pod can sometimes be the most tedious part because you have a bunch of environment variables. You have volumes to mount. You got ports to worry about. But you need a good default. So I made this default as the go-to for you should have all this stuff at minimum in your pod spec. And it's mostly around health checks and security and making sure that you can't jump into root automatically. Like these are the things that don't populate by default all the time. Probes, maybe. Like if you're using a plugin and it's recommending IntelliSense style, it's probably going to show resource readiness probes. Maybe some linters will complain that you don't have resource limits. So if you're using something like Hadoop, is it Hadoolint? I think is the Kubernetes one. Or is that the Docker one? It sounds like the Docker.
That sounds like the Docker one.
Yeah. A great linter, by the way, this will really help you is if you're in your repos, you use something like SuperLinter if you're on GitHub. There's one called Mega Linter if you're not on GitHub. And this will help if you run this either locally or in your CI on every commit, which is what I do. All the examples are in my GitHub for all of this stuff. I have a dedicated repo just for SuperLinter examples. And in here, you'll notice there's Dockerfile linter. That's the Hadoolint is the Dockerfile one.
Yep.
And then you have, and ironically, you have a linter for the GitHub Actions itself. So often I'm changing my actions based on linters that are running against my actions in the action. Yeah, I have an action to run the action checker. That's essentially what
kubeconform.
That's the new one. That's a better one now. It's better than the some of the older ones that got deprecated. So kubeconform. This will help you for sure.
Yes.
I think this also now works with like a Helm chart maybe. No, maybe not.
I would not jump into Helm right away if you're still learning just straight Kubernetes YAML. Get good at that first.
Yeah. The only reason I'm saying this, sorry. No custom. It's not even mentioning custom in there. That's unfortunate. I say it because usually we're not all writing native manifests. We're writing Kustomize or Helm or something. And a lot of these linters in the past, Kubernetes linters have not worked with those and would tell you that like those things don't exist and all that. And it would be frustrating. Like kubeval, I think, didn't work with it. So your mileage may vary here. So this is something that I would always use on my repos. So I hope that helps. Next question.
Just one thing. So Dan said, so Traffix is proxy to a proxy. One thing you'll realize when you start doing container orchestration, whether it's Docker or anything, Kubernetes, it's proxies all the way down. It's just layers of proxies.
Not turtles, but proxies. Proxies are like turtles. Proxies.
Yes. So, modern web, proxies everywhere. All right.
Conrad put the entire stack in a single chat message. Thank you.
There we go. Yeah.
But Dan had another question. If you have an app per repo, does each repo get a Docker file? Yes. Every time you have an app, it has a Docker file, and that's with the app. If you're doing mono repo, that means like probably a folder per app, and there's a Docker file in each folder. There are times where you can, if you get advanced, you can figure out how to make a single Docker file for a bunch of different microservices that are all the exact same dependencies, but let's calm down a minute. You don't have to do that at first. Like you can just and as you see your Docker files all start to look alike, then that's when you maybe get some creativity into your Docker file and you do one app per build and you have maybe a target stage. Anyway, you can get really fancy. But yes, the rule is one per repo, one per app, wherever that app lives. If it's a binary that's going to run in a container, then it gets a Docker file. in the root directory. Some people put them in subdirectories. I mean, we don't do that for make files. We don't do that for a whole bunch of the other typical files, the package JSON, the gem file. Those are all in the root. So to me, Dockerfile is a part of that build. It's a single file. It belongs in the root.
So you're telling me not to create a nested 16 folder structure and then put
you
my
can totally
Docker
do
file
that. Okay. If that makes you happy, sir, I approve. I approve. I don't recommend it, but I it's all about your developer happiness.
There we go.
All right, alrighty. A couple more questions, then we're out.
What do we got? I'm deploying. Which one are you pulling up?
You go. I'll find it.
I think Kareem. I'm deploying microservices app into multiple environments. All of that is managed using Argo CD. What do you recommend as fit branching strategies?
Well, more info always helps. So while we're talking about it, if you have more info, feel free. Recommend as fit branching strategies. I'm not even sure what fit branching means. Maybe that's a typo. Maybe you mean Git branching. Sorry, Git branching.
Yeah. Oh, maybe. Oh, okay. So Git branching strategies. Have you seen what do you typically see, Bret? Is it like namespaces per like feature branch, that kind of thing?
Yeah, and I'd say that the branching style is a culture thing, right? Very much a culture thing. And it largely depends. The biggest difference I see in branching styles. Now, you said Argo CD. So one of my big questions, Kareem, is, are we talking about your application branching, or are you talking about Argo CD YAML branching? Like, personally, I don't do custom long-running branches for any DevOps repo. I feel like it's trying to shove a round peg in a square hole kind of thing with YAML, and it's mostly YAML or TOML or whatever. I don't do branching strategies that way. I typically subfolder all in the same style of main branch and a dev environment with Kubernetes YAML. Those are just different subdirectories, and you might have environments as direct. Like it might have a main environments directory. In fact, you can actually see this. I think maybe in my Kubernetes. So I have environments. I have the base Kubernetes YAML that's just the default, and then environments directory, and in there each environment gets its own directory, and those are just overrides. So those only change what is necessary. For example, this will mount a database schema file essentially, and we'll pick the proper tags for each one of those images. Sorry, it's a little small. So that's how I and the teams I work with do DevOps. Now in the app directory, or sorry, the app repos, their style is honestly based upon how they deploy, what their application customer is. If you're putting open source on the internet, you're probably tagging releases on GitHub. If you're ever doing open source like that and you're actually providing people with a product, you're making tagged versions so that you can have release notes and you can have these official, and then the main is where all the action's happening, but it's not really ready for release. And you don't end up with like dev branches, or like, I don't see a lot of that in some open source, at least a lot of the open source packages I work with. In companies I've worked with that release traditional software, and I bet you, Nirmal, you've seen a lot of this, working with larger companies that have internal only apps, or maybe even they have customers. Their customers are external, and they're doing sort of traditional software a couple times a year. You've got version 4.3.1 getting released at the same time of version 5.0 gets released, and you have to track these long-running versions. They often, I find, will have multiple release branches at the same time, and their PRs are pushing to different branches.
Yeah, so that they can backport like security fixes and
their default branches often like develop or something. It's not called main a lot of times. It's because it's never deployed to a customer because it hasn't been pinned to a. They don't use tags as much when it's closed source. At least that's what I find. Like, they use branches instead of tags, I think.
So there is we we do have an EKS workshop on GitOps. There's also a video there of that, but it's going to have to match what you're trying to do. I would highly suggest, since it seems like you're kind of learning, Kareem, how to use GitOps, start simple, because Argo CD allows you to do very complex patterns with deploying apps to you can deploy add-ons and applications to multiple clusters from multiple repos, all merging in different ways. It can get very complicated very quickly, but you don't need to do the complicated stuff just to get like an app deployed. Honestly, I would say use this as an opportunity to experiment with the different branching strategies and folder structures, so that you can kind of understand the trade-offs between the different ways of doing it. And it's okay to paint yourself in a corner now while you're like figuring this stuff out, but there's no right way to do it, because it's going to have to match your organizational structure. The real world, and also the real world is messy. Like there's no way for anyone of us to kind of say like, oh, this is what every company does. Like that doesn't exist.
Yeah, that is true. And I think consistency matters, right? So it's nice if developers are managing, like developers who are primarily developing software, if they're also managing the DevOps or the deployments, the style of deployment repo design and all that stuff, and the branches versus and tags and like how that works is largely going to be the same. I tend to find that it differs with this whole idea of I don't use additional branches very often other than just for pull requests in GitOps and DevOps, is mostly because I'm coming from that ops background. I'm usually working with larger teams that, yes, they're mostly all primarily developers, but they're not working on application code, and they're wanting Git as simple as possible. One of the things that I actually use as my own little internal metric for do I make a branch for this is, do I see myself switching back and forth between branches a lot to copy and paste things between branches? If that's true, if there's a likelihood that's going to happen, and that's very common in DevOps, to have to like have repetitive things for different environments or different configurations, or internal, external, this cloud, that cloud. Like I have a lot of repetitive stuff there. If I end up doing branching, oh my goodness, it's so painful, right? Because you feel like you're doing a lot of work, like copy paste that file, and then you end up with two clones of the same repo, one in each branch, and you're copying back and forth and trying to keep things in sync and doing a lot of commits for what? Like there's no real value there. So that's when I
keep it simple. Yeah, keep it simple on the onset.
And so many of these things are templatable, or even not customized, but even Docker Compose, you can layer those files on top of each other with overlays, and now we have this thing called includes, and those don't really work as well across branches. They work really well when they're all in the same branch and the same folder structure at the same time.
Yep.
So I don't think there's an official stance on this in the world of DevOps, but my official stance is don't branch for environments, don't branch for divergence in configurations, only branch for pull request updates or when you want to temporarily change stuff, and you keep everything in a single branch that's being used anywhere else, whether that's a hot take cluster or whatever. What's that? That's a hot take. Hot takes today with Bret Fisher. Don't use branches for DevOps.
Don't use branches.
YAML. Yeah.
Don't use branches.
Use branches for pull requests. Features only. Features only, not environments.
There we go.
How about that? All right, last question. And you're welcome, Kareem. You're very welcome. And DJ's got to run. We're going to have to run in a second. Conrad agrees with us. Dan asks one last question. I know he's been persistent, so we will get to that last question. Dan wins today for the most questions asked. Thank you, Dan. Always has great questions. Yes. How do you do the Docker Compose with all those apps? So I think he also asked a question earlier. How do you use Docker Compose files when you have like a repo per app? What do you do? Nirmal?
I'm trying to find the question.
Okay.
Okay.
Does
If
each
you have
repo
an
get a
app
Docker
per
file?
repo,
Yeah, we answered the Docker file question, but we didn't answer the Docker Compose question of what do you do with a Docker Compose file if you have an app per repo? So if you maybe have a front end, a back end, a worker process, some sort of a proxy system, a caching system, like you have 4 or 5 different parts and they're all in the same
yep.
Compose file. Where do you put it?
So this goes back to um, what I've seen or what I've done is have a separate repo for deployment of the system as a whole, and in there are the different files for different deployments, right? So I'll have a Kubernetes deployment, I'll have a Docker Compose deployment, folders, and then the Helm charts in the Kubernetes one, and then Docker Compose files in the Docker Compose one. And there might be other deployment systems, whatever other ways you want to distribute your software are mapped there. There's no perfect solution for this. You could do with includes now, you could have a Docker Compose file in each repo with that section for that app, and then have your main deployment repo with the main Docker Compose that just includes all the other ones. But that's a relatively new feature, so I don't think we've experimented with the rough edges on doing it that way. How about you, Brett?
No, I would echo exactly what you're saying. Like the default is just, it depends on how many teams you have. You have one team, put it in your most popular app repo. So like if everyone needs to use the API, but some people are front end, some people are back end, some people are, they're working on worker processes, but they all need the API, then just store the Docker Compose file in there. And then everyone assumes that they're all putting their different app directories in the same parent directory. Could figure that right word. The parent directory has all the different clones of different repos, so that they're all consistent paths. And then you can use a compose file that has the .. and you can sort of bring all the repos in, or like Nirmal's saying, you can do some of this new includes stuff that actually allows you. There's a brand new, I think it's even a beta feature that we just talked about. Is it last week? I think we just talked about that you could use includes with a Git repo URL to include other YAMLs of Compose and bring them all in together. But I wouldn't bother doing that unless you had like multi-teams where one team was responsible for this set of apps and one team was responsible, and you didn't really want to mess with each other's stuff, but you did want to use each other's Compose files. I would keep it simple with a single file. I do have this great article from August, again, on the newsletter that I wrote around includes versus overrides versus extends. I have some great links there on how that all works. My favorite is overrides for development. I love putting an overrides file in the same repo with my regular Compose file as a template, and then I rename it when I get it locally. So I actually call it dockercompose.override.template.yaml. It's a pretty long name. But the Docker compose.overrides.yaml is in my git ignore, so no one can commit it. And then every developer gets to copy that file, rename it to Docker compose overrides YAML. That single file lives on my machine alone. It's never committed, and that's where I put all my custom favorite stuff, my own ports, my own environment variables, however I want it configured. And that overrides the default that's in the repo. That's a super sweet feature. I use it all the time with teams. I implement that sort of workflow of, rename it to a override file, and Docker just automatically adds it on every Docker Compose command. It's a sweet little add-on feature that's not obvious for people. So, hey, look, there we are from a previous episode. We looked so much younger 22 episodes ago.
Speak for yourself, Brett.
You haven't changed a day. I look 5 years older. Well, thank you, everyone, for being here.
This was a great show, even for me being late. Great questions. Boom, 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 boom.
Yeah. Of course, if we didn't get your questions answered, we will be here again next week. We will have a topic. We will have a guest. We're going to do something next week. We just don't know what it is yet. And we've got a list a list of people coming up, great projects. We got Phil from AWS showing up, Phil Estes. We're going to talk about Finch, which is
Yep.
another great alternative to using Docker Desktop locally, or if you have a machine that you can't use Docker Desktop on, or if you just want CLI tooling, like this is another thing. We've got a bunch more episodes. We got K2D is going to come up from Portainer. You all know about Portainer. Portainer is a very popular tool. Let's just plug that for a second. So Portainer is one of our favorite tools. I think it's still today the most popular Docker Desktop extension in the ecosystem. And they have a brand new project called K2D that we're going to have a special episode on. We're going to have an episode on Portainer. We're going to have another episode on K2D. That is the idea. Okay, this is the idea. I haven't seen it happen yet. Kubernetes API on top of Docker so that you don't have to run Kubernetes. It's just a single container that runs on Docker, and it emulates the part of the Kubernetes spec that you could just do on a single machine, like running pods and running deployments. So could this? It's on a single machine, so it's not K3s, it's not K0s, it's not a mini Kubernetes. It's just emulating. It's like for IoT. It's meant for tiny little machines that don't even want to run the control plane of Kubernetes.
Kind is Kubernetes in Docker. This seems like a translation of Kubernetes API to Docker elements. You'll have to come back.
Alex, this is for people that can't run Kubernetes. That's what this is. This is for people that...
Alex, you're going to have to come to see the guest on the show, talk about it to find out.
Right. That's right. K2D. We're going to have some great guests for that. We're going to have the CEO and founder on to talk about it. So we're awesome. Excited. Neil's going to be here. Anyway, Nirmal, I'll see you next week, man. I hope.
Maybe.
We'll see.
We'll see each other soon.
Well, thank you all for being here. Sign up the newsletter. Go join the Discord. It's right above Nirmal's head. We'll see you in Discord after this, where we hang out. Yes, it shows up in your room every time we have a show. Don't you see it?
Good to see you, Brett. Thanks for having me on, and thank you everyone for the awesome questions. Later.
See ya.
See ya.